Good afternoon and welcome to BioAfrica Talks. I'll just quickly begin by introducing myself. My name is Monique. I'm a research professor at the Durban University of Technology, and my work interfaces at the moment between public health and the humanities. I just wanted to make a couple of introductory remarks and just to say that we are in a really interesting time, and this webinar was scheduled actually before the President's address on Sunday night. But it's incredibly timely because I think vaccination and mandatory vaccination is definitely on the mouths of everybody at the moment. And it's something that people have opinions about, but at times are not able to articulate. Because there is so much debate and dilemma around this particular issue, which affects us all deeply, individually and collectively. And I think today really allows us to get some perspectives on what this mandatory vaccination means for a variety of different people across disciplinary groupings, but also across age groupings, which I think is really important because we do need to hear the voices of students, the voices of professionals, the voices of workers through representative groupings. And we do know that currently NEDLAC is sitting to try and negotiate an outcome that is applicable and appropriate to the context in which we find ourselves here in South Africa. So we all await for the outcomes of that negotiated agreement to see where we will be stepping as we go ahead. We do know that there will be mandatory vaccinations, but the shape and form that that takes and the exclusionary principles that will be enacted and how that will be enforced remain very much unclear at the moment. But we are sitting in a space where, like some of our international brother and sister countries, we are facing the reality of mandatory vaccination. So it's not my role to talk to this from my perspective, but rather to say that we have with us today 4 divergent views on mandatory vaccination. And I will introduce people individually as they're about to give their perspectives. They're each going to speak for a fairly short period of time, which is 5 minutes, which allows them to just put across their viewpoints around mandatory vaccination. And we're going to start today with Warren Manning. He's an occupational health and safety practitioner in private practice. He has a variety of different degrees to his name, including in chemistry, biotechnology, safety management, and occupational health. And I think last year, significantly, Warren did publish a book which was on the codes of practice and guidelines of occupational health and safety. I think Warren takes a very worker-centered approach to this conversation, and I'd like to welcome Warren to give his presentation for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you, Monique, and thank you for inviting me to participate. Yeah, my concerns about the looming compulsory vaccination, especially in the occupational context, stems from some concerns I have around current practice in occupational health and safety, specifically in occupational medicine and more focused in terms of medical testing in the workplace, occupational medical testing. And what I think could be the lack of the regular, the normal ethical requirements to cover that kind of practice in the occupational context within our current framework of bioethics. You know, we can talk about the patient in terms of our ethical framework. We can talk about the participant in medical trials, and then we in this case we can talk about, we might focus the employee. And these are not equivalent definitions of people from a legal perspective. And I would question whether the employee is benefiting from the same level of protections provided by our health legislation and so forth, as provided to patients in private or public healthcare or participants in medical testing and trials. Our occupational health and safety law is very fragmented and possibly to become more fragmented, and unequal protections are being provided to workers in different sectors of the economy. Not everybody is covered under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Further concern is the trends that are there in the amendments to the acts and the regulations, I would argue, are undermining some of the democratic foundations that are key to these pieces of legislation achieving the intended goals. So obviously, vaccinations are a critical part in occupational health and safety. They're proven throughout the world for many vaccine-preventable occupational diseases, and so there's no question about their value and the necessity of them in the occupational context. So that's really my concern, is that the way in which the mandates are going to be put in, the form that they're going to be put in, and how will they especially affect the balance between these two competing parties within that relationship, the employee and the employer. If we are not careful about how that happens, it could result in a strengthening of the position of the employer with respect to employees. And this will be a serious concern. There might be many unintended consequences because of that. And that's really where my concerns come from in terms of the looming compulsory mandatory vaccination in the workplace. I think I can stop at that point. Thank you, Monique.
Okay, thanks very much, Warren. So just to flag a couple of the points that Warren has raised with us, I think the key point Warren is raising is the issue of power and inequality and how that plays itself out within the workplace, and how one begins to equalize that as we move forward in this process of mandating vaccination. So something definitely for us to all think about. Thanks very much, Warren. And I know that the issue of ethics is something that our next speaker, Dr. Gugu Buthelezi, is going to be speaking about. She is a Paediatric Specialist who is currently working at King Edward Hospital based in Durban, but also plays a very key role in teaching and placement setting for final year medical students at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So Gugu, I'd like to welcome you to give your perspective.
Thank you so much. I just want to share my slides. Good afternoon, everyone. So in August this year, I had the opportunity to present this topic at our departmental journal club meeting. So after the first patient was identified, the first battle was the development of a vaccine, which required global scientific and political effort. That effort was successful. However, governments and healthcare workers throughout the world now face a second battle, which is how to persuade a sufficient proportion of their populations to accept the vaccine in order to effectively suppress the virus. However, as Prof. Mudli from the Department of Medicine and Director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Law at Stellenbosch wrote in the conversation that she believes that it's no longer a matter of whether the vaccine mandates should be introduced in South Africa, but when. So she goes on to say that ethically, vaccine mandates are justifiable on multiple levels based on the common good and public health ethics framework. So this framework is based on the principles of solidarity, effectiveness, efficiency, proportionality, as well as transparency. It intends to achieve three things in public health emergency, and that is first to save lives, secondly, to use limited resources efficiently, and finally, to create social cohesion in the public interest and to build public trust. But as a doctor, medical school teaches us that we need to consider medical ethics. So how is this incorporated in the discussion of mandatory vaccination, especially that of autonomy, which states that all persons have intrinsic and unconditional worth, and therefore have the power to make rational decisions and moral choices. And each should be allowed to exercise his or own capacity for self-determination. Much of the work of the field of bioethics actually takes an individual-centered approach, while public health, however, is not generally concerned with the individual level, but with the population level. And it's not always easy or appropriate to apply concepts such as autonomy, which carry quite considerable weights in the traditional bioethics literature. The term public health refers to the efforts of society as a whole to improve the health of the population and prevent illness. The emphasis of public health policy is therefore on prevention rather than treatment of the sick and the population as a whole, rather than the individual, and the importance of collective efforts poses a particular set of ethical problems. In traditional bioethics, much of the emphasis is placed on the freedom of the individual in terms of consent, treatment, and information. Whilst these freedoms remain ethically of consideration in public health, they are woven into a complex fabric in which many different players have roles and responsibilities. And it's not uncommon for governments and institutions to actually mandate certain actions or types of behavior in order to protect the well-being of individuals and communities. Such policies can be ethically justified, as they may be crucial to protect the health and the well-being of the public. Nevertheless, because policies that mandate an action or behavior actually interfere with individual liberty and autonomy, they should seek to balance communal well-being as well as individual liberties. While interfering with individual liberty does not in itself make a policy intervention unjustified, such policies raise a number of ethical considerations and concerns, and should be justified by advancing another valuable social goal, like protecting public health. Contemporary forms of mandatory vaccination compel vaccination by direct or indirect threats of imposing restrictions in cases of non-compliance. So typically, mandatory vaccination policies permit a limited number of exceptions that are recognized by legitimate authorities, for example, with medical contraindications. Despite the name mandatory vaccination, it's not truly compulsory, as in there's no force or threat of criminal sanction that is used in the case of non-compliance. Still, mandatory vaccination policies, they limit individual choice in non-trivial ways by making vaccination a condition of, for example, attending school or working in a particular industry or setting, such as a healthcare worker. Such policies are uncommon, and in April 2012, the WHO, the World Health Organization, stated that they do not actually support the direction of mandates for COVID-19 vaccination. However, they do urge that it's better off to work on information campaigns and making vaccines accessible. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thanks, Gugu, for that very, very useful presentation. And just like I did with Warren, just to flag a couple of points that I think Gugu has raised. And that is that, we are operating within a medically conflicting ethical framework. She's put across the real debate between public health as something which is common and communal, and something which is about autonomy, which is very much individual. And I think what we're finding with the mandatory vaccination is a very real internal and external conflict around this dilemma which we have, because of the limitations, as Gugu put it, that it places on us in terms of our freedom of association and even our freedom of speech, because I think a lot of people have become quite anxious about what they say about vaccination or not vaccinating. So that's a really useful presentation for us to pick up on in the conversation, which will happen shortly. Our next presenter, I'm very happy to introduce. He's not on video yet, but I'm sure he will come. And that is Mr. Thabang Tlale. Thabang is representing, I think, the voice of younger people. He's currently doing his final year of education majoring in economics and business studies at the Northwest University. But more importantly, perhaps, is that he's the chairperson of research and community engagement of the South African Students' Union, the South African Union of Students. He has another interesting achievement to his name, and that is that he was the provincial secretary of the business chamber in Northwest. So I'm imagining, Thabang, that you will speak to us both from the perspective of a student, of young people, and possibly some insights into what this may mean for the business sector for young entrepreneurs. Thabang.
No, thank you. Yeah, like Prof have indicated, my name is Thabang Vincent Tlale. I'm the outgoing chairperson of the SCC, or rather the Secretary General of the Northwest University SRC. There's a new one in office just a week ago. They've been sworn into office. I'm currently the portfolio chair for research and community engagement in SAUS, South African Union of Students. And of course, this topic is around, what we are busy discussing as the union, together with the SRCs. Of course, we don't agree with the mandatory vaccines, but as the union, we embarked on a journey to encourage our students to go and vaccinate. I mean, we are taught that before you cross the road, you must first look at your right, look at your left and your right again. Then we can cross if it's clear. But in this instance, we believe that they're not given enough information regarding the vaccines, regarding the COVID-19. So we are just told to cross. Taking a mandatory vaccine is like being told to just cross without watching at all sides. So yes, the provincial secretary business chamber position.
But there seems to be a technical problem, so I'm wondering if we should move on and then bring you back in a few minutes. But just in case Thabang is not able to come back in a few minutes, it seems like there's a problem. I think what he seems to be raising is an interesting perspective on behalf of the students, that on the one hand, there is this real feeling of not having enough knowledge about what the vaccine is about in terms of putting it into one's body. And there doesn't seem to be much support from the student body for mandatory vaccines. However, there does seem to be an awareness that students should vaccinate and an encouragement of that campaign, certainly at the university that Thabang is at, which is Northwest. And hopefully we'll be able to get Thabang back on board shortly, but at least for the conversation. And so I'm going to now introduce our last speaker, and that is Mr. Pomelani Mushumi. He is an honors in philosophy student at the University of the Western Cape. And what's significant, I think, about him is that he is currently the president of the first SRC that is led by the EFF. And so I'm sure he's no stranger to controversy. He's a former legal and transformation officer of the Economic Freedom Front and a political commissar of the UWC branch. I think he sees himself primarily as a student and political activist, and with strong Marxist ideology. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Prof. We are, Marxist proponents. So even here, we won't be sharing far too deep, in terms of those aspects. So I think for the most part, the latter speakers have captured at least the points that I wanted to speak on. And Tlale, when he was speaking, he really just hit the nail on the head, really, with the approach, because that's the entire argument. The argument isn't around the quality of the approach of the policy. Now, when the land debate, for example, was being debated, what was central was public engagement, because it's a policy position that is going to change the trajectory of the economic pattern. So for the most part, what you must come to admit is that politics are going to necessitate that you engage the people. And that's just a contentious issue that the African National Congress was not willing to engage our people. And I think, it's becoming a trend with this government to not want to engage our people. Perhaps an example that comes to mind is that when there was civil unrest both in Gauteng and KZN, what the incumbent president did, instead of engaging our people, at least through public representatives, like councillors and premiers, what he did was to take platform and to paint the entire protest, as it were, as tribal protest, as opposed to just coming to agree that there is a political nature that has to be observed here, that our people are not monsters, not devoid, devoid from logic. They are people who can be engaged. I think that's one aspect that is not being dealt with, the anti-democratic posture of which the monetary policy, takes. So in EWC, what we did was to be far more democratic, because I think what stems out of this discussion is that what universities do, far more than not, is that they take the lead insofar as policy shifts, and EWC, unfortunately, in this regard, has taken the lead once more. The leading society, what they do, the policy position that has been adopted before I describe what you did as received there, is that they said that if you want to come into WC next year as a student, at least to access campus, you will have to be vaccinated. And I think, what we said to them is that we'll engage the students, we'll do what you don't want to do. And in our engagement, it's like what Tlale was saying, in fact, before, was cut off again, is that our people, our students are not afraid of the vaccine within itself. They're not afraid of science. They're not people who are unengageable. It's just that they don't understand this dynamic far more than not. They don't know what is being spoken of, and what they hear is once in a lifetime address from the president, and they see media, but it's not a far-reaching engagement with our people, and that's what we did in WC. So I think that's the that's the concrete aspect, that the political nature, from these former activists now who operate government, they must use the tactics that they use to destabilize the country back in apartheid, and they must engage our people. They must.
I think we have the gist of what you're trying to say. So I'm going to just do perhaps what I've done with the other speakers. So just to say thanks, Phumelelani, for that input. And I think the key points that you are raising are really two main ones, which are very significant. And the one is that, that I think, we have a lot of access to information at the moment through television, radio, social media. But what is perhaps missing in what you are saying is actual direct contact with experts and with people that are making these sort of guideline policies and directives, to actually really engage at a level in which people are able to respond and to articulate their fears, their apprehensions, and their misunderstandings, if you want to call it that, because it sounds to me that there seems to be confusion around, various aspects of the vaccine itself, if not about COVID. And it is critical that you raise the point that many of our politicians are experts historically in the kind of engagement at a grassroots level, and that is no longer happening. And the result is, I think, a vacuum between how people experience this current dilemma which they find themselves in, and what is being articulated particularly from politicians, but also from scientists and experts. So with those four presentations, I'm going to maybe ask a couple of questions for the panelists. And then after that, I've been asked to open it up for conversations. The first one, actually, I'm going to refer to a question from one of our attendees, but it's an important one, which is, it really does relate to the point that Phumelelani was talking about, is how do we have public engagement when gatherings are prohibited? Well, they're not entirely prohibited at the moment, they're just limited. But the question is, what form could those take? So if anybody maybe wants to answer that for now, and then I'm going to answer any other questions. And any of our panelists, please just go ahead and unmute yourself and respond.
I can take it, Chair, if no one.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, no, I think you're correct. I was about to argue the same point that there's a limitation, and once again, we always create this idea that policy positions or the framework, at least for lockdown, is coming from heaven. It's once again a politician's work, crafted, done through the NCC, and NCCC, which finally decides how the direction is. So it's not a far-fetched idea to say that we're going to now go to Tanzania, for an example. We're going to engage starting from NU1 until NU18, and we're going to approach this thing in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's not a far-fetched idea. You mobilize all councillors, you call them in one venue. You create many mouths with one message. It's not, a distant idea. It's a very pragmatic thing that can be done, which can be crafted by the very same politicians, as I think was emphasized by the chairperson, that these are their expertise. These people destabilize the entire country, through similar tactics and far more aggressive and superiorologically, intertwined tactics that, speak to mobilizing people, to spreading the message. It's not a difficult task for them. When they campaign for elections, you should have seen them. They're everywhere. So it's not an impossible task. It just needs to be monitored far more with precision, and the same vigor that they use when they're trying to excite their funders in terms of the political party. So it can be done. Rest assured. Thanks.
Well, thanks for that response. I think your point about elections is well taken. But I'm wondering if there's anyone else on the panel that maybe wants to respond to this notion of public engagement. At the moment, that engagement is happening through NEDLAC, but it isn't really happening at the more institutional or local level. I don't know if there are any responses to that before we move on to the next conversation.
Maybe if I can make one comment or two. So yeah, absolutely. And part of the concern is that there's, on the one side, we have scientists and politicians that are sort of have a tag team that's dealing with the issue. And what about everybody else in society? Our society is complex, and we need government to facilitate all sectors of society to express the complexity of who we are as South Africans, so that we can have a forum. I mean, we're supposed to be moving into the fourth industrial revolution, all of this, and probably it's one of our lessons that we have to learn is about really engaging people using the platforms that we can unleash using technology. So more diverse voices, make that circle bigger, so that people don't feel it's just an echo chamber between politicians and government, and they seem to be having a very cozy relationship, and everybody's concerns are being sometimes disregarded in very harsh ways. So I think definitely the other people in society, other sectors in society, who their voices must be facilitated. Thanks for that.
I think, Warren, that's a very important point, which is that, when we turn the television on, and I think this is like a general thing, I don't think it's that it's been censored, but the only voices that we are hearing at the moment is from politicians and scientists. But it's a very particular group of scientists whose voices are being heard at the moment. And I'm not putting a value judgment on that. I'm just simply saying that that is the case. We all know that science is itself a very open endeavor. and we can almost prove anything we want to prove. So I think that point is very well taken. I wanted to ask another question before I move on to some of the questions that have been raised in the chat. And that is really about the dilemma that medical practitioners also face in dealing with individual patients who may not want to be vaccinated, and what the conversation would look like with patients who do want to assert their individual autonomy. And I'm not just talking about doctors, I'm talking about also people that interface at the much more public health level, particularly community-based nurses, and even social workers, psychologists, and so on. You know, what should those conversations be looking like? And that doesn't have to necessarily only come from Dr. Buthelezi, it can come from anybody on the panel, because we are all affected by this issue.
Perhaps I should start. So I just wanted to go back to the previous discussion as well, that question. It's quite interesting because there's a review that was done by Cooper and their colleagues, and they actually looked at about 9 surveys that were done across Africa earlier this year. And they're basically trying to determine what is causing people to be hesitant to taking vaccines. And then once you figure out what are those determinants, and then you can actually focus your interventions through that. So one of the things that was raised is definitely what Phumelelani was saying, and my colleagues in the panel, is that you have to engage the community. One of the things that was said is that there was a missed opportunity for government to actually speak about how they are looking into the safety of vaccines when AstraZeneca was actually pulled out of the vaccine campaign. So that was actually a missed opportunity to actually speak to people and say, but see how we are actually concerned, and we do have measures in place to figure out things that go wrong within the campaign and within the system. So they also spoke about, in that article, they spoke about how what you're saying about scientists and healthcare workers, that in as much as the discussion looks like it seems like it's between scientists and the government, this is also an opportunity for scientists and government and healthcare workers to actually do an introspection. Have an introspection and look at the systems that are in place currently as well, and how we communicate. It's a brilliant opportunity where we can merge sort of medical things that we are used to as a medical community into the public. So it's an excellent opportunity to have discussions, but I think that currently it's happening at a level that is beyond, just above where people are. So if we could bring the discussion down to the level that people will understand in every level. So as a student, in a student level, what would students understand? Engage in a student level. So as you're talking about in terms of patients refusing to take vaccinations, that's the ethical dilemma, where in terms of us as the medical fraternity, we've been taught throughout our undergraduate years to think about ethics and autonomy. But now, as this is a public health issue, autonomy seems to be taking the back fall, because now we're talking about what is the greatest interest of the public. But I think if you explain to people what that means, that you actually have a moral obligation, you're not being forced. I think talking about mandatory makes it feel as if it's a force on people, you're compelled, but we're actually, we're appealing to your morals, to say that everyone should do public good. Everyone has a responsibility to do public good, and not just to be the freelancer and take the free ride, where you'll think that if I don't get the vaccination, everyone else will get the vaccination. And then that means that we'll be protected because everyone else will be vaccinated. Therefore, we'll have herd immunity. Therefore, I will be protected. And I've also saved myself the trip of going to go get the vaccine, the annoyance of feeling a tiny prick. So I think essentially, to answer your question, is it's basically to engage with the people ask people, what are your concerns? What are your fears? What have you heard? And how would you like us to help you to answer some of those fears?
Thanks, Gugu. I mean, I think that would be an exceptional medical practitioner who is able to engage with patients at that level, particularly in the public health facilities where the space to do that is very limited. But I think, the 2 points that you raise is that we do have these institutional spaces where that engagement can take place, whether it's at universities or whether it's in public health institutions, whether it's at schools, because, schools are now a real place of debate around vaccination, with many kids not wanting to be vaccinated. And I'm talking about the 12 to 18 cohort, because I have kids in that cohort and I know that they are very anti-vaccination. And I'm sure as a pediatric specialist, you would have also interfaced with kids that are very anxious about that. So I think it's about creating platforms. Warren's point about them being, using technology, but also actually realizing that we do have face-to-face spaces that are critical. And the question then becomes, who is responsible for those engagements? We can't simply believe that government and politicians are responsible for all of these engagements that everybody across the board in this panel has spoken about. So perhaps the question is, who should be leading those engagements? And I'd like to invite Thabang back into this conversation, and then Gugu and Warren, please feel free to talk about who's responsible.
All right. Yes, of course, from my argument or my point of view, totally we don't agree with the mandatory vaccines. And but it's not like we are not agreeing to be vaccinated. What we get from the ground from our students is that we need a proper or enough education around COVID-19, enough education or awareness around the vaccines, because currently the government is battling with certain private sectors or certain organizations because of the lack of information provided, lack of proof shown in terms of the effects, because there are conspiracies going around, you understand? So with us, if only students can be given enough time, if they can be given enough education, because you'll realize that the students are not more political. They won't understand perhaps if this is from political point of view or what is happening. So that is basically what is happening from the ground, to say, let's give people enough education. Let's make them understand the importance, if there is the importance of vaccination. You cannot force people to vaccinate. People need information first, and that is currently what is happening.
Okay. Thanks, Thabang. I'm not sure if that's the end of your input, because I think you've disappeared really quickly. But I'm going to just see if there's any other answers from the panelists about who should be doing the engaging. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the next question, which I have, which is really related, and please feel free to just come in at any point and answer any question, even if it's already feels like it's past, before I go on to the really interesting chats that are coming up. Warren spoke specifically about the power relations between employers and employees, and the anxieties that this is raising, because it seems as though employers will have the right to take action, which may not be as punitive in terms of criminalization, as Dr. Buthelezi has already outlined, but it could be punitive in terms of restrictions to the workplace. And so the question then becomes, how do we find mechanisms to equalize the power relations? And is that even possible, Warren?
Yeah, I mean, serious challenge. For example, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which is one of a few acts that deal with occupational health and safety in the economy, one of its key institutions is the Health and Safety Committee, which is made up of health and safety representatives. And one would really have to ask some serious questions about how companies have facilitated the development of those health and safety committees. Are they really the forum that the law intends them to be, where all issues are on the table, all matters relating to occupational health and safety are dealt with in a programmed way, where there's deep discussions, debates, and agreement, and where they are revisited periodically, could be quarterly, whatever, so that these issues are dealt with deep consultation. The key thing that keeps coming up here is autonomy. Autonomy is critical in all issues, including even in adopting conspiracy theories. It seems to play a big role in people. As an expression of their autonomy, they take on these alternative explanations of things. Autonomy is critical for the development of health. We know that, earlier you spoke about other professionals, social workers. I mean, developmental social workers have got a hell of a lot to teach. And in the way they build autonomy with people in the most desperate contexts in their lives, and they build it from the very first contact. We have to be focusing on building autonomy. It's a responsibility of all professionals. There is no loss-free or cost-free alternative here. But one thing is essential: we have to build autonomy. We have to build democracy in all our ways. If it's not central in our practice as professionals, we have a serious problem, and ethically, actually. Thanks. Thanks.
I think that's useful. Thanks, Warren, and it really raises questions around what the workplace looks like right now in terms of platforms for engagement. Occupational health and safety forums are one space, but I think we also know that that the shop floor, which was very active historically, is no longer that active, and so we don't really have the sort of union presence to be able to run those shop floor conversations that were happening previously. We're talking now mostly about employees as being fairly working class, but we know that people are employed across the class spectrum, some in more professional spaces as well, where you may not have occupational health and safety forums, and so, but there still is a real sense of inequality, as there always is, between those that manage and own workplace operations and those that simply come in with their labor, and how that authority is dealt with in a way that does not seem to be totally autocratic. Is a very complex situation, because I think what Gugu was trying to say is that there is a moral debate here as well. It's not simply about health, it's about our responsibility to the collective, and this is where the issue of what is really moral, what is the right thing to do, is really the point of engagement. And it's very difficult for anybody to come in and say, we have the moral authority to tell you what to do with your body. But I think, the other point that was raised by the panel is that, and I think, Warren, you articulated this nicely, where you spoke about the idea of autonomy being critical to the management of our own health. And that is true. We manage our own health best when we feel that we are in control. Whether we're dealing with a chronic illness, whatever that illness may be, diabetes, hypertension, HIV, TB, when we make informed choices about how to deal with that particular illness, we feel that we have control over these bodies in which we live, and that does take sometimes quite a lot of engagement to make sense of what is the best decision for people as individuals in terms of owning their own bodily space. I'm going to move now to some of the questions that are in the chat, and I hope that I've got them all on the page that I'm looking at. I'm going sort of backwards. So I'm beginning with the last one, and anybody can answer this. It's an interesting one, and it's the role of alternative medicine. One of the questions is, what happens to more natural remedies as a way of dealing with this dilemma? And certainly working at DUT, I know that, for example, the homeopaths have a very different view on vaccination to what other medical practitioners do. But we do need to think about the role of traditional medicine, non-allopathic medicine, and the voices of those in the plural healthcare environment in which we all operate. So if anybody has an answer to that, I don't know if there are any. I know that we have silenced the voices of the non-allopathic medical practitioners. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that question.
I think that's quite an interesting question, Prof, that I think a lot of us actually haven't spoken about, even in our discussions with our peers. I do know that one of the things that were discussed was prayer, where most of South Africans, when they are asked prayer versus the vaccine, most of the South Africans thought that prayer was more effective than the vaccine. So I think in a way that might actually go in with the natural remedies. But I think in the question, they were talking about the treatments for COVID-19 versus now when we're trying to prevent the illness. So I'm not quite researched in terms of have there been any preventative natural remedies that have been put forth and researched to actually be effective. But I think that's quite an interesting consideration that we should actually look at and discuss in platforms such as these.
Yeah, no, I think that's useful. And I don't know if anybody in the chat has an answer to that in terms of the more preventative capacity of non-allopathic medication, but certainly there should be engagement with those groupings, because they do, there is quite a strong hold of non-allopathic medication in South Africa, particularly around more traditional medications. And another group which has been very silenced in all of this debate have been traditional leaders. And having just returned from the Free State last week, and having met the king there, I was quite interested to learn about his central role in the decriminalization of cannabis. And I didn't know that until I met him, but I think that there are some interesting and very progressive traditional leaders whose voices we really do need to hear, because they have a huge amount of authority in some of the very large spaces, which are not necessarily as urban as many of us are more familiar with. I'm going to ask a couple of questions around first around the workplace, and then more medical questions, because these are the ones that are coming up. And I don't know if I'm not aware of these cases of people who have already been dismissed for not being vaccinated in any workplaces. I don't know if that has happened. And if it has, how are these issues being resolved? Where does one take the complaint to? And, within what rights? I certainly do know that actually this announcement was only made a few days ago, but I have already had a variety of messages from groups that I belong to say that they are now not allowing people to attend forums without proving their vaccination status. And I'm quite amazed at how quickly that has happened. So I'm opening that up. What happens when somebody feels that they have been unfairly dealt with in a public space or in a workplace as a result of the vaccination mandate? And anybody can answer that, really, because Thabang, this will be something that will affect universities soon as well.
Just a short response on my side. Also, I don't really have deep knowledge about cases, but I did see that the CCMA made a statement that they were receiving quite a number of complaints. I think the news article said a few thousand, in fact, where people had felt they were prejudiced because of their vaccination status. So I think we're going to see more of that.
Yeah, I think that's correct. So it's, you know, it's a little bit early to know exactly what the legal ramifications are going to be, because even though, Gugu, as you said earlier, you know, this is not, you know, there aren't criminal sort of consequences to this. There certainly are legal consequences to it. And, you know, because the law is not just about criminal law, it's also about civil law. And I think that there are going to be a whole variety of civil law and labor law issues that emerge from this. And we do need other professions like the legal professions to enter the fray of these conversations as well. The experts that we're hearing at the moment are predominantly medical experts and scientists. So another question that's emerged in the chat is around pregnant women and how safe it is to vaccinate. There seems to be some confusion around that. I'm wondering, Gugu, I don't want to answer that, but you can answer it. But I think, you know, when I read this question, I realized there almost has to be a set of, you know, most known questions that need to be put all over the place, that people are, you know, can have a reference point, or at least a, you know, an emergency call line that they are able to get hold of advice around these kinds of questions, which people are quite confused about currently.
Absolutely. I think that's a brilliant question. And I think it highlights also what has been said, is that actually this pandemic is looking like more of an infodemic, where that means there's so much information in all various medias, and it's difficult for people to actually decipher which information is the correct information. Is this coming from a reliable source?
Yeah.
So I think that is something that has been a huge problem, especially around women and pregnancy, and those women who would want to fall pregnant in the future, maybe not now. Does the vaccine maybe cause any fertility issues? So currently at the moment, women of childbearing age should vaccinate, and they can vaccinate. There's been no adverse effects that have been reported. Children, women who've recently had babies can also vaccinate. Breastfeeding women can also vaccinate. There's no side effects that have been actually put forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, the important thing, there are other questions related to the quality of information that we're getting, and also the divergent information. And that is partly because of the role of social media, but it's also because I think people are feeling that some voices are not being heard, and it's very difficult to engage through, for example, a television around these conversations that are taking place, which just makes the point about engagement much more important, and really the critical need for these helplines. Because another question, which is medically related, is of course around the booster shots and how accessible those are, and whether or not those are really important, and will the mandate include the booster shot or exclude the booster shot. We won't be able to answer all of these medical questions, but I do think that they are incredibly important to have clarity on as we move forward. Phumelelani was saying that he wanted to respond quickly to the issue of the moral dilemma that this raises. So if you are in the room still, Phumelelani, please go ahead and answer that.
I wanted just, you know, there's this aspect, you know, that, you know, people want to sneak in, you know, of this, you know, seemingly on the surface of it, it seems like an African-centered ideology, whereas, you know, around common good, etc. I feel it's, you know, for lack of a better description, you know, a bit of opportunistic, you know, argument, you know, because for the most part, you know, you can't say to me, you know, I'm an African, so to speak, you know, if I'm taking it to the far extreme, of course, you know, if I'm rejecting something I don't know about, for an example, I'll make an example about myself. I'm a lover of science. I'm a person who respects science, you know, respect it as it is. It is what it is, you know, but you can't expect me to, you know, to say that I respect science and then on the basis of that simply accept the vaccine, you know, because I want to be engaged on it. I want to, you know, but I think now I'm just like a broken tape repeating the same argument that, for the most part, no one is rejecting, the vaccine within itself, or by extension rather, or of course, that it's a common, must make it far more, communal, so to speak, and then me vaccinating and everyone vaccinating is a benefit for everyone else. No one is disputing that argument, but I think what has to happen in the first instance is an acceptance of the political nature of the vaccine, the social implications of it, and attending to it on a social level, as opposed to just running. I think, it's been argued, running the same argument that scientists and medical practitioners and experts are the only people who have the solutions for this thing, whereas that's not what is happening. The people who draft policy positions are not medical experts, they're politicians. So I think I wanted to just redirect that question, that no one is disputing, making the vaccine, a common good, and making, a aspect that everyone, or ultimately everyone must take, or it's better to have it that way. But I think the first instance is that let's have a dialogue around it, and let's not move in a esoteric and elitist type of arrangement. Let's engage our people, and that's the argument.
Okay, so I mean, I think that's a really important point. Sorry, I realize we have actually got 30 minutes left, so that's great. Phumelelani, I think that what you're raising is critical, and that is that morality is a contested thing in itself. There is no one moral way of being. There are different communities of thinking what is right and what is wrong, and we sort of have this idea that we can homogenize morality. And yet I think that that's not really possible, because, we come from systems where our morality is so informed by the very different environments in which we operate, organize, and have been developed in terms of both the way that we think and the way that we feel. And so I really think, this moral imperative, which is the argument that is often made, that it is, your rightful duty to be responsible to the common good. Many people think that they are actually acting morally by not putting into their body something that they are unsure about, and it's a very complex situation, particularly for people, again, that are dealing at the interface with public health systems. I think there's a couple of comments that I wanted to read. The one is that says, I think there needs to be an understanding of the types of vaccines that are available for COVID-19. The point that's been made, of course, is that vaccinations, do not prevent disease, but rather prevent serious illness resulting from the disease. And I think that too is very complex, because it's very different, perhaps, from what people understood vaccines to be like in terms of other illnesses. So I don't know if there's any comment that anybody would want to make around that. That people are saying this is not as preventative as they would want them to be. And therein lies a whole other dilemma. Anybody that wants to answer that before I get back to the public engagement issue, which there are a lot of questions around.
I think the issue of vaccination, especially now as adults, so in the adult population, right now we want to vaccinate against COVID. And that appears as a new issue in the adult population, versus I'm talking about myself as I'm in pediatrics. So in the pediatric population, we're used to vaccinating children.
Yeah.
But now when we've all been vaccinated, most likely, the majority of the adults currently have all been vaccinated, but we were not vaccinated fully aware, as we're all children at that stage. You get what I'm saying? So now it's becoming more difficult as an adult, now that you have autonomy, you have understanding, you have consent, you have questions. So I think that's where the difficulty in terms of vaccination, with people wanting to know, what does it vaccinate against? Why am I not protected completely from the disease? Whereas in the pediatric population, it's an absolute norm to vaccinate against various different illnesses right from birth. That also brings, sorry, Prof. That also now brings a totally different, also a different challenge now that we're going to face now with children being vaccinated as well. Is that now, so are children going to be vaccinated if their parents have refused vaccinations for themselves? Or also if parents have vaccinated themselves, but now they're unsure of how that vaccine is going to affect their child. So what's the response of a vaccination to a child versus an adult? Some surveys have been done, and basically they found that most of the people who said they would not vaccinate their children were mothers versus fathers. Fathers were more willing to vaccinate their children at any age group, but mothers were more saying no, they will not vaccinate their children, whether they have been vaccinated or not.
Okay, well, I mean, that's something that I certainly wasn't aware of, and I'm sure many other people listening today, and I think, it is often mothers that land up being responsible for taking children for healthcare checkups, for dealing with any illnesses that might emerge. It's not to say fathers don't, but predominantly it is mothers. And if mothers are hesitant, it's probably because they're not really sure about the impact that this will have on their children. I think that, being a mother of a school-going child myself, I know for sure that young children at school are very, very ambivalent about this. And I would suspect that the majority of children are refusing to do this. And this is not only about conflict between parents, it's conflict between parents and children, where children also feel that the right to autonomy sits with them as well, because they have an understanding of their rights, even as people under the age of 18. Because they live in their bodies. And I think this is going to be a very complicated, space for engagement, but really goes back to the initial points raised in the panel around the forums of engagement. And I think really schools become very critical. And it goes back to this point, it doesn't have to be politicians or even healthcare workers that do these information sessions, but it could well be educators who have been given the opportunity to be in spaces where they can learn more about the debates, about the moral issues that emerge from this, as well as the scientific evidence that is available, and to share these with children at school level as well. I'm just checking what else is here. Okay. The question, and I don't know the answer to this, is information around, well, I'm imagining the answer is yes, but I could be wrong. Is the information that is required around vaccination available in Indigenous languages, or is it currently limited to mostly to English? I'm not sure about the answers to that. I don't know if anyone has an answer. Maybe our panelists from Cape Town and from Free State can answer whether any information has come across in languages other than English and Afrikaans and isiZulu. Phumelelani, do you know? Do you have an answer to that?
Oh no, okay. Oh, I thought you asked someone else. No. And as far as I know, no. I don't think it's indigenous. But I can't confirm. I'm not sure. But I wouldn't assume that our government would be that proactive and be that accommodative of our people. So I would assume not, but I'm not 100% sure. Thanks.
Okay. Well, we have an attendee that has said the answer to that is yes, and they have provided a link, and I'm imagining the link has the translations in it. So I think that's really useful because we can't have all the answers as an expert grouping or as a panel grouping sitting here. But it's certainly, if it does exist, again, it's not something that many people know about, and that's critical. You know, what comes to mind as well is what we have learned from other, if you want to call it pandemics, or very widespread illnesses in our country, that really are viable lessons for us in relation to vaccination. So if we think, for example, around, you know, how ARVs became something that are now pretty normalized, what are the lessons that we learn, and when does it happen that people default or they're not retained on chronic medications, and what is going on there that we can, you know, that we can carry forward into this conversation around vaccinations? Any answers around that, since it is a biomedical forum?
I think for me, the biggest lesson in terms of your example, specifically with HIV and with COVID, is firstly having the access available to everyone. So I think having access to vaccinations readily available to everyone. And I think in the way that the schedule was done, the rollout schedule, with starting it slowly and slowly and slowly, I think that may have actually caused people to become more hesitant as the time was going by. And having, where you find other countries overseas, first world countries, have more access to vaccines versus us, where we struggle to get vaccinations. I think that was one of the most, for me, one of the most important lessons that we should have learned with HIV, dealing with the pandemic.
I think that that's a really critical answer, Gugu, because, you know, just from engaging in the public health space, which I do at the moment, dealing with people who are heroin use dependent, what we know is that people only come for treatment when they feel that they're not going to be judged for what they put into their body, which in this case is heroin, and are able to seek help because of the accessibility of the, you know, the healthcare facility. And I think that this notion of accessibility cannot be understated. People do need to feel that they are able to walk in a fairly short period of time, know that they don't have to provide thousands of documents to be able to prove that they are a living human being, and just know that that is something that they have the right to access. And I think you're absolutely correct that the staggered approach has in itself led to perhaps some hesitancy, and maybe a delay in what people's initial responses were. Because certainly I remember just from working, you know, during lockdown level 5, we were operating from the underground parking lot at Moses Mabhida Stadium with 200 homeless people who were on opiate substitution therapy. And I remember at the time, the majority of those homeless people were requesting the vaccination because they had begun to hear about it. But what we know now is that the majority of the clients that we see who are homeless are not going for vaccinations. Whereas at the point where information was available, because people were in a collective space, there was much more of a willingness for that, and also because there was an ongoing engagement with medical practitioners, mostly primary healthcare workers, who were nurses. Okay, so the questions that are now coming up, I guess one of the useful things in the chat group is this idea, and again, this may be something that Thabang and Phumelelani may want to respond to, is how do we get almost, the word that's used here is marshals, but really on the ground educators who are responsible for information campaigns and for answering questions. And is this something that government should be paying for? In other words, you know, having people who provide information at localized, in localized areas. Who should these people be? Who should be providing the training? Should this be something which, actually could be part of a public works program in some form or the other? So I'm opening this up for anybody who wants to respond.
Is Tlale coming in, or can I?
Go for it.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think, in the first instance, public representatives must really not be underplayed. I don't diverge from this argument of having politicians play this central role. And by politicians, you always just think you're the president of a country. No, it goes beyond the president of a country. We elect people, every 5 years, whether in local government elections or national and provincial elections. So I think, when we speak of, before we even go to NPOs and NGOs, and all other segments in terms of organizing people, even before, in fact, I would even say, we come into universities, because we've lead, society gives that burden of leading, sciences and all types of expertise to universities. Before even going to universities and having them lead this, the ground, the people who are publicly elected, councillors, premiers, mayors, those are the people I think should be taking this charge. That's their responsibility. Even if you go check the rental offices, those people are not doing anything because it's locked down. They're not doing anything. They're eating our people's parcels monies without any type of work. So I think, I don't diverge from this question. Intellectuals must keep on writing journals. We must debate in terms of how they must operate on the ground. We must advise councillors how to operate on the ground, but I don't think it's our responsibilities. I'm saying ours here very loosely because I don't regard myself as an intellectual. I'm very hard. But I think the aspect of saying that the public representatives must play a far more central role is perhaps one argument that I don't need it to be weighed down by giving a series of examples or a series of people who should be taking that baton. Public representatives must take their rightful position and be, public engagement forums within themselves.
Okay, I mean, that raises a whole lot of questions around what a public intellectual is, and generally public intellectuals are people who see themselves as intellectuals, usually working in university spaces, but who make knowledge available for public good. But I think that there are intellectuals, all over the place. So, everybody has the capacity to think critically and to impart knowledge.
No. Sorry, I meant, sorry, Prof. I said public representatives.
Okay.
Not public. Not
okay.
Public representatives like councillors, people who are publicly elected to look over a specific land of people that exist and are accounted for. Sorry.
Okay. Well, that's a critical point, I think, because we have just got new local governments in place, and maybe this is a very good test of how local government will be able to govern this issue, which really does affect people at the most local level. And so that's a good point, Phumelelani. It's an important test to see whether actually this does sort of come down from national government through to local governments, because we do know that the executive mayors sit on the COVID council, and so really they are very, very involved in these conversations and how one resolves the dilemmas around the decisions that are made within the council. There's a question here. I think maybe Warren, you'd be most rightful in answering this one. And it says, as an intern who has started working and have 1 month's experience in an organization, how do you navigate vaccine mandates while you are still learning about company policies?
So absolutely, I was chomping at the bit to grab that question. So absolutely critical that I would suggest that from the first days of a person's training, apprenticeship, tertiary education, whatever it might be, that within that curriculum of education and training, not just the ethics of that occupation or trade or profession, but also the requirements in terms of occupational medicine, must be discussed with the student, from the get-go, from first year, so that there is a, whatever it is, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years period of time where the student can really grapple with the issues, with what they're signing up for, with their bodies, which is really their property. What are they signing up in it? I want to become an engineer. I want to become a teacher. I want to become a nurse. What am I actually signing up in terms of my body? I'm going to enter into a work context where all of a sudden which happens now, all of a sudden you find out that, well, these are the things that are going to be required. I'm going to have to go for this regular medical examination. I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to do that. And I think we need to, I've been trained with the idea of informed acknowledgement. If we recognize that as a healthcare professional, I'm going to have this battery of vaccinations and booster shots, and I actually, consent is actually out because it's not voluntary. It's going to be compulsory. You have to, but at least there can be informed acknowledgement where I can, in a process, understand exactly what is going to happen to my body. I can ask all the questions, and if I don't want to sign up for that, I can redesign my career. I could still be a healthcare professional, but I could put myself in a different context. So the idea of informed acknowledgement, as I say, something that I'm trying to figure out, because I think it will tone down a lot of the stress people are going to, so people can, in a critical way as well. We have to critically engage with things as we find it, not just be positivistic, with regards to the law or the policies, but we critically engage with them. The role of professionals in corruption and state capture in South Africa is well established. Has the curriculums, curricula at the universities changed for people to really engage with the ugly face of their professions? So, and that would link in what I'm saying about medical obligations. So I would say make the most of this crisis. One of the lessons would be start engaging with students at the first opportunity about what's going to happen, what's the obligations that they're signing up for in terms of their bodies. Thanks, Monique.
No problem. I think that's a whole interesting discussion around how one prepares students for the world of work in various different ways. And I think it's something which doesn't happen, particularly at the more sort of academic universities where people are just sent into the workplace and have no idea about how to navigate their position within the workplace, regardless of whether it's about their healthcare or any other aspect of it. So that's really useful, this idea of consenting to various policies and laws, whether they be health related or otherwise. But it certainly brings to my mind the important role of human resources officers in the workplace going forward. Again, this has become an incredibly medicalized realm, but it really is HR that is going to be sitting at the interface of what happens to people when they don't comply, whatever that may mean in relation to individual workplaces. And so we really do need to be thinking much more broadly around who the experts are, what their training is, how to facilitate the kinds of conversations. And to go back to what Gugu was talking about earlier, is how do we begin to really allow people to articulate their fears and their anxieties, their concerns, their uncertainties in having a conversation that is bi-directional rather than unidirectional. And that's really, raises the concerns that Thabang and Phumelelani were having around, the lack of voice, which I suppose they've mostly experienced as young people in this mix of conversations around vaccination. We have only 5 minutes left, and I'm going to raise a question that has been put into the chat, another one, around whether the panel thinks that if people had a choice around which vaccination they could get, that they may be more open to being vaccinated. I know that for many people, outside of healthcare workers and police and a couple of other groupings, it was not a choice. You took whichever vaccination you were given at the site that you went to. And some people didn't care, but many people did, because they'd heard that some vaccinations had greater efficacy than others. So I don't know how one deals with that, because that in itself is a huge area of confusion for many people. The debate, particularly around around which vaccination is at this moment most effective across the variants which we have. So I don't know if anybody wants to answer that as something which does need to be addressed.
I think for me, the answer is possibly yes. Because if you also, you spoke about whether people feel one vaccine is more efficacious versus another. But another concern that people had is, well, initially, before we started talking about booster doses, is getting one vaccine versus getting the Pfizer 2 jabs. So some people would have opted to rather get what all the healthcare workers initially got, which was one jab. And I mean, if you look at like the current stats, so I just looked at it yesterday afternoon, the fully vaccinated population, so those that has received, if it was Pfizer, so if you receive both the jabs, that was at 36% versus those who've only been partially vaccinated was more higher at 41.5. So you're starting to wonder, were people actually more agreeable to taking just one shot? Hence, you're getting the 41% versus the 36% now who have been fully vaccinated. But now that's going to be a different discussion, where now we're talking about these different variants coming up. We're talking about booster vaccines, not only for the J&J, but also for Pfizer vaccines as well.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that, Gugu. I think it's really useful, and it certainly does, this all adds to the complexity of what people are feeling in relation to, we do know that many people that have had the first Pfizer vaccine have not returned for the second one. And this is really problematic, but it goes back to this idea of what the knowledge base is of people, but also possibly your earlier point around accessibility. How easy is it for you to leave work in the middle of the day and get to your local vaccination place to have your second vaccine when you've already negotiated that in your workplace once before? But one would think that as this becomes mandatory, there needs to be leeway made for allowing people to do this. And again, this takes us back to the point about the role of human resources in the workplace as well. I see we have 1 minute left, and I just think that it's really simply my role now to thank all of our panelists for their really rich inputs and for engaging with the questions that have come up in the chat, and for opening up the space for us to speak about something which is really, really complicated. It's complex, but it's also very confronting, and it's not going away. And so these conversations need to continue to happen. I'd also like to thank, on behalf of everybody here, the organizers of this event, and the foresight that particularly Dr. Mshumi and his team have had in organizing this event, actually prior to the announcement. So I think, this is a platform amongst other platforms where ideas are expressed and where some confusion may be unpacked, even if it doesn't lead to clarity. So thank you very, very much for this afternoon's conversation, and to everybody for joining us. Thank you, everybody. It was really a great learning experience. Super good. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.